Good afternoon. My name is Alexander Dodge. I'm an associate professor at the Department of Geography at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology. And today I'll be talking about petroleum wealth and stranded assets. I think the prevailing wisdom is that often countries that attempt to build wealth from off the back of development from fossil fuels tends to fail. I mean, Venezuela, South Sudan, Nigeria are examples of this. And yet this idea that developing oil and gas can be a pathway to wealth tends to nevertheless continue to be part of that development myth around oil and gas. And here, Norway is also often shown as an example on how to do this right. Norway serves as a kind of set of guidelines for what to do if you want to avoid some of the fates of other nations when it comes to developing oil. However, often the problem here is that the history of the country and a retrospective view of sort of where Norway was at that time when it started to produce oil and how it might be, how this has changed from the past often gets missed in those discussions. So what I want to do with this presentation is first I want to discuss why some countries end up not becoming wealthy after developing oil. And then I want to discuss the sort of the history of Norway and what actually Norway did to develop its own oil industry and to avoid many of these challenges that other countries have faced in the past. But what I want to do in showing this this history and giving this overview is to try to explain why in today's moments, given the climate crisis that we face, the current global energy transition, and the notion that fossil fuel assets might become stranded in the future, means that today's emerging oil and gas economies will face a very different situation than Norway did in the past. So as I mentioned before, natural resources are often not a guarantee for wealth. In the literature, there is this concept of the resource curse. And that is the idea that the larger dependence on oil exports is on average associated with lower growth for oil exporting countries. And there's several reasons given in the literature for why this might be the case. Lack of innovation, poor productivity growth, weak rule of law, price volatility and its drag on economic and fiscal stability. So in the long run, a 10% in oil export share is associated with 7% lower GDP per capita, as shown in this graph in this slide. And another explanation for why this might be the case is what we call the Dutch disease. So the Dutch disease refers to a decline in the Dutch manufacturing sector in the wake of a natural gas discovery on the country's coast in the late 1950s. And here, Dutch workers outside the gas industry began to lose their jobs as a result of real appreciation. And the idea is that as economies discover oil and gas and start producing oil and gas, they consume more than they can process. A country suddenly has a huge influx in money, consumer demand increases quickly, and the booming industry starts drawing workers to it. It drives up their wages. Workers are able to buy more things. They bid up the price of houses. Houses become more expensive for consumers all types, and wages in other sectors are ratcheted upwards so that these workers can also afford houses. However, the problem here is for other workers who are involved in other export industries beyond oil and gas, when their wages increase, suddenly those other export industries start to become uncompetitive. Unlike oil and gas, which has tended to generate high revenues, other export industries might not be able to generate revenues at that same level, and therefore these other export industries tend to decline. And what happens then is the economy becomes even more dependent on oil and gas exports, which can be problematic because in times of booms, these prices are quite high, but these prices tend to be quite volatile. So there's two factors here. Real appreciation, which is that the windfall from natural gas resources generates inflationary pressure in the domestic economy. Inflation drives an appreciation of the currency's exchange rate, which makes other exports outside the oil and gas more expensive. And then you have the resource pool effect, where new money in the domestic economy will increase the demand for skilled workers and capital investments, sucking them into the oil and gas-based economy, which again crowds out investment in other export sectors in the economy. And then the economy becomes more dependent on natural resource sector, has fewer economic legs to stand on, and becomes more susceptible to radical swings in commodity prices. So other sectors tend to lose out because of this, of the Dutch disease. And that can be problematic also because of this enclave economy effect of the oil and gas sector. Oil and gas extraction tends to be concentrated in among specific workers, among specific sectors, and there's few linkages to the rest of the economy. Sometimes you get these fly-in, fly-out developments or camps around oil and gas fields, where workers within those fields have little attachment to the surrounding regions, creating this kind of enclave economy where there's a lot of wealth in these particular camps, but the rest of the regional economies tend to be quite poor as a result of oil and gas economy. And then again, there's weak linkages between the oil sector and the rest of the economy. And there's challenges for local economies to participate in capital and technology-intensive parts of the petroleum value chains. But Norway, despite this being well known, despite this being well documented in the literature, Norway often becomes pointed as the example for why emerging oil and gas producers will avoid these fates that other countries have experienced. Norway first produced oil in 1971. Today, oil exports account for around 40%. There tends to be quite low rates of unemployment and income inequality, and there seems to be a low and steady level of inflation. So it seems to be a quite different situation than many other countries developing oil and gas. And often in that discussion, you'll point to the sovereign wealth fund. And so you'll point to pundits will point to the sovereign wealth fund, showing that Norway has an incredibly large state pension fund, which it has developed since the 1990s. And this pension fund seems to be a example for how to manage your wealth correctly. And the idea with the pension fund is that instead of having money from the oil and gas industry, creating all these inflationary effects within the domestic economy, what countries will do is they'll take the tax revenue from the oil and gas industry and they'll basically invest it in shares abroad. So what happens then is you don't get these inflationary effects. So in Norway, there's a rule that only around 4% of the annual return of that pension fund can actually be used within the domestic economy. Now, even though this seems to be the go-to way on how to manage petroleum wealth in order to avoid these challenges such as the Dutch disease, it's important to note that Norway actually didn't develop this fund until the 1990s, even though it started producing oil since 1971. So for the first 25 years, Norway's oil income wasn't going into a fund. Norway's oil income was actually being consumed as rapidly as it was being produced. So the question is, if the oil fund isn't the reason why Norway became wealthy from oil, then what is the reason? Well, one of the things that Norway did since the beginning of the oil industry is it moderated the pace of development. And here the idea is that you avoid those inflationary pressures and avoid the Dutch disease, making other parts of the economy uncompetitive by slowing down the pace of development to give the economy time to adapt and the rise in domestic purchasing power. And the idea here is to stimulate local supply and build up local content. So in 1982, Norway set up a PACE committee that was designed to regulate the speed of development. And in the first 2 decades, oil and gas authorities were using revenues to pay back debts, build out local competences, and so on. So instead of and another important reason why you would want to moderate the pace of development, making sure that it goes slowly, is because that you want to build up local content and local competence. So one of the things that the Norwegian government did is it took time to develop Statoil into a skilled operating company. Foreign companies were required to cooperate with Statoil in the transfer of the industry-specific knowledge, skills, and expertise. Statoil was Norway's national oil company. And in the initial stakes in the field, Statoil's stake was only 50% because it needed to collaborate and cooperate with these other oil and gas companies, foreign oil and gas companies. But through that collaboration, Statoil was able to build up its local competence, build up its skills and knowledge in terms of operating oil and gas fields and in terms of exploration. And by not basically opening the floodgates and allowing all oil and gas to be produced all at once, this moderated pace of developments allowed Statoil to eventually start to take higher stakes within later fields. So in later fields, Statoil would come to own around 96% of equity in those fields. And another thing that the Norwegian government did is it used its licensing regime to ensure that 50% of research conducted by oil companies related to developing oil on Norway's continental shelf should be done domestically. Now, Statoil's ability to have large equity stakes in oil and gas fields based on its own knowledge and expertise within operating fields was something that would be able to later stimulate local content developments among oil and gas, the oil and gas supplier industry. And it's important to note that this oil and gas supplier industry in Norway didn't develop out of nothing. Before Norway developed oil and gas, it had a large economy within hydropower, aluminum, chemical products, all based on sort of cheap electricity from hydropower. And a lot of it also had a large maritime industry and shipyards that were in the shipbuilding industry. So the shipbuilding industry and the hydropower industry were able to use its competence and expertise to start to enter into this local supply chain, which again was being governed by Statoil, which had the large equity stakes in its on oil and gas fields. So. But at the beginning, these companies were, the tasks that they were doing weren't entirely advanced. They were building semi-submersible rigs, but a lot of this was about sort of pushing and shoveling concrete to build these rigs. It wasn't only after time that these companies started to build more technologically advanced production installations. And to be able to enter into the more advanced aspects of the production of the oil and gas production network. So over time, these companies were able to take advantage of the higher value-added aspects of the production network. So and another key aspect of this was also that Norway put in quite stringent environment and safety regulation measures, which it collaborated quite heavily on with the supplier industry in order to be able to meet these regulations and thresholds. But what this happened to do was to sort of make these companies more competitive in an international environment than other companies. So what you get is an entire oil complex surrounding oil and gas fields in Norway that has been developed over time, where companies work on seismic evaluations, data processing, drilling and drilling services, engineering, leading in subsea technology, and so forth. So by the 1990s, Norwegian oil service companies had conquered all links in the value chain in offshore petroleum activities. And there was a high degree of specialization. So then around in 2021, around 204,000 employees are related to the sector, where 25,000 were operators and 90,000 are in the specialized offshore supply industry. So in 2012, these petroleum sales, refinery sales, offshore supply industry started to account for 86% of Norway's exports. So this sounds all good and great, but the question is, can other countries follow Norway's example? And there's some key points that I want to point out on why the situation for emerging oil and gas producers are different than the situation than it was for Norway. So first, it's important to note that Norway was relatively wealthy before it discovered oil. As I mentioned, Norway had a large hydropower sector. It had very cheap electricity, which it was able to use for different other export industries like aluminum. It had a shipbuilding industry from before. So Norway wasn't in a poor standing when it came into the oil and gas industry. The other aspect was that in 1973, the Arab oil embargo gave Norway a considerable amount of leverage when it came to forcing foreign oil companies to invest in research and development and in local contents. Here, high prices and increasing nationalization meant that countries like Norway were more attractive for oil and gas companies, and therefore Norway had more bargaining power. Of course, also Norway had a relevant base for local content development. The other aspect, which isn't mostly heard about, is that the North Sea, where a lot of oil and gas fields in Norway are operating, is a very challenging environment. It's a very difficult environment to work in. There's quite hazardous conditions. And this provided quite a lot of opportunities for technological development among Norwegian suppliers. It also meant that there was a lot of focus on environmental and safety regulations, which again, at that time, weren't entirely developed as well. So in collaboration with local oil and gas suppliers, Norway was able to develop these issues. And the other aspect is that, at that time, oil and gas production networks or value chains were quite integrated, meaning most of these different functions were done by international oil companies. But today, these production networks are much more fragmented, where companies like SLB, Baker Hughes, Halliburton, Technip FMC, these large multinational global offshore supply industries, are supplying a lot of the services and products needed in the oil and gas industry. So the challenge here is then for new emerging suppliers to actually be able to develop the skills and requirements necessary to enter into these value chains. It's not as simple as simply knocking on the door to the international oil companies and saying, we need to do we want this and this opportunities, when in fact these skills and services aren't even run by those companies, but are run by service providers located in other countries. And another important aspect is before the 1990s, things like the World Trade Organization and EU regulations that demanded the removal of protectionist policies weren't in place. So Norway was able to do a lot of these aspects because the international trade rules around it weren't in place in the same way that they are today. But Norway was lucky that when those rules came into place, Norway already had a competitive international supplier industry, so it was able to export a lot of its supplier industry to other countries. But another key challenge for countries trying to produce oil and gas today goes back again to this question, to this point I made earlier about moderating the pace of development. Again, it took a long time before Norway was able to build up the local content it needed to be able to be competitive within the oil and gas industry, and to provide benefits that spread beyond a single part of the industry in terms of exporting oil and gas, and to create linkages with other aspects of the economy. But today, that time is running out in those same regards. So this notion of stranded assets is particularly relevant here. So stranded assets are this idea that assets can suffer from unanticipated or premature write-offs, downward reevaluations, or be converted to liabilities. The concept tends to be applied to financial investment in fossil fuel infrastructure, but it can also be expanded to things like people and their training within the industry, to entire cities like Stavanger, which are quite dependent on the oil and gas industry, infrastructure, property, and so on. And the idea of expanding this concept comes to the notion that industrial development within a particular sector creates several path dependencies and technological lock-ins, such that certain capacities and institutions are unable to adapt or be reoriented to changing circumstances. Thus, these certain industries and capacities and institutions become stranded. So according to McLeod and Akins, over 1/3 of oil and gas reserves and half of global gas reserves need to be unburnt in order to meet a threshold of 2 degrees in order to avoid the worst effects of climate change, which will result in that assets lose significant economic value well ahead of their anticipated useful life. So if you look at the IEA and what they say about particular scenarios, such as STEPS, stated policy scenarios, or the announced pledge scenarios, or the net zero scenario. In the announced pledge scenarios, oil and gas needs to decline around 2% on year on average to 2050. In the advanced APS scenario, oil soon peaks and then declines to 93 million barrels per day in 2030, and then declines to 55 million barrels per day in 2050. In the net zero scenario, we can see around 77 million barrels per day in 2030 and 24 million barrels today in 2050. And a general rule is that each gigawatt of installed renewable capacity can displace anywhere in the range of 200 to 800 million cubic meters of natural gas in the power sector. And this will have an increasing effect on prices. So in a APS scenario, 2050 might be lucky with $60 per barrel. In net zero scenario, it'll be around $25 per barrel. And a carbon tracker report shows that 28 of 40 petro states would lose more than half of their expected revenue under a moderate paced development, which is defined according to the IEA announced policies scenario. So $8 trillion worth of expected revenue would be wiped out between today and 2040. And in the demand environment of a net zero scenario, any new oil and gas resource developments would need to be matched by production reductions elsewhere in order to avoid oversupply and fossil fuel lock-in. But the challenge for a lot of countries that are considering now to start exploring for oil and gas is it takes awfully long time from you start exploring to actually when you start to develop oil and gas. So, for example, Uganda discovered oil in 2006. It just reached a final investment decision in 2025. Guyana started exploration in 2008. First oil was around 2022. Equinor started exploration in Tanzania in 2011. There's still no final investment decision on the natural gas fields in Tanzania. And Mozambique started exploration in 2010, and a final investment decision came around 2019. So on average, it takes 7 years to develop, with a standard deviation of 9 years from discovery to production. But countries with no previous oil exploration can expect to see a much larger delay in those regards. So what does this all mean? Well, think about what is required to actually govern the oil and gas industry well, so that it's possible to generate wealth from the industry. Well, first, you have that timeline from going from just starting exploration to development, which, as I've shown before, can be, so many years before that actually happens. And then even after that, for a country to be able to have a long-term development horizon regarding that, it needs to have several decades in order to be able to build up the local competence, local expertise, in order to develop a supplier industry such as the one that Norway has, in order to become wealthy. So of course, Norway has the sovereign wealth fund, and that has incredibly high revenue at the moment. But that's only possible because both politically and economically, because Norway has a large local supplier base, where there's quite a lot of tax revenue to be able to be generated from that local supplier base. If Norway didn't have that, and didn't have that capacity to develop local content, then the politics and economics around a sovereign wealth fund would be much different than it was in the 1990s. But again, moderating the pace of extraction means that you're increasing the risk of your reserves becoming stranded assets. The longer you're waiting to develop those reserves, the larger the risk that those that oil and gas resources will be at a lower price at the future, or oil and gas prices will be at a lower price in the future and won't be cost competitive against other producing nations such as Saudi Arabia. So developing a good oil economy means mobilizing resources, finance, and institutions to develop domestic linkages, but this risks locking in domestic capacities into the petroleum sector, capacities that could be used to develop other economic sectors. In order to be able to develop local content, Norway spent a lot of time and effort in institutions, universities, financial institutions, in order to build up a capable local content sector over a long period of time. But imagine if a country did that today, how many lost opportunities there would be in terms of developing capacities in other sectors that have a longer term horizon than the oil and gas industry. So a general rule of thumb is that today's assets in the oil and gas industry are tomorrow's liabilities. So that's my presentation, and I hope based on that, this will provide better information on the role in development, wealth, and the oil and gas industry. Thank you very much.